Okay, so thank you for having me. Welcome to Florence. And I want to talk a little bit about Florence, not in a very technical way, but to give you a sense of why Florence is a fascinating place to be in if you're thinking about social networks. And so I have to, how do I click here? Okay, so Florence is famously a place, first of all, phenomenal place to visit and just a great place to hang out for a while. I hope you'll have a wonderful time. Famously, it is a place of innovation. Alberti wrote a treatise on the development of perspective in graphic arts, and so that painting had a kind of focal point and it develops a three-dimensionality to it. This was quite a revolution in visual arts. I've studied a lot about accounting techniques and insurance instruments and all kinds of stuff that revolutionized the commercial world. And a lot of these techniques like double entry bookkeeping are still present today. The Florentines developed a system of public finance where people would contribute to the public debt and they kept track of this. And then they had sophisticated mechanisms for discounting the value of those debts and so on. It's a place of civic republican government. They thought they were reestablishing a kind of Roman republican understanding of a collaborative ruling enterprise. And this term is used self-fashioning. It's really applied more to the 16th and 17th centuries. But kind of the idea is that individuals began to think of themselves as works of art and to develop a kind of individuality. Professor Contractor referred very in passing there to Vasari, who wrote Lives of the Great Painters. And he portrayed each of these painters as having an individual personality. So this was something different than the Middle Ages. You can't really be in Florence and think about Florence without recognizing that it also was a deeply traditional society, a very patriarchal society. Typically, men would marry at age 30, 35 to women who were about 14 to 16 years of age. Women were not allowed to walk around town freely on their own. Many women died in childbirth because that was their kind of primary goal, and and that just was kind of the dangers of the time. It was an extremely Christian society. If you walk around the city, you'll still see these small parish churches. Those were the center of life for many families. They prayed regularly. They were very concerned about their salvation. These businessmen doing sophisticated accounting practices and commercial transactions were also very much thinking about the usury doctrine of the church and that it was sinful to make money without producing things. So that was a concern. And it was corporatist in many ways, by which I mean groups had a strong control over different aspects of life. There were the guilds that set standards for economic activity for the various industries that they represented. There were 7 major guilds and 14 minor ones. As you wander the city, it was divided up into neighborhoods. Families lived in the same neighborhoods for decades and even centuries. Okay, so like they did not. There was not a lot of mobility in that sense. There was a lot of mobility into the city by newcomers. But once established, families were very sedentary, and there were these things called confraternities, which were sort of like civic associations, like the Rotary Club or Knights of Columbus or something like that. And this was also a place where people felt some bonding. If you're around the Duomo, you still see one of the ambulance services is run by something called a confraternity. So there's a certain legacy of this continuing. How did I get interested in Florence? I did not plan to do this when I started graduate school, but I became interested in networks because to me, they had a kind of realness to them, a materiality to a concreteness. And I appreciated that over more abstract ways of thinking about the social world. Florence is a great place to study networks because they left us a ton of information about themselves. They had extensive documentation of their kinship records, baptismal records, sponsorship through godparentage type relationships, their office holding. They rotated through offices every couple of months, and we have bi-monthly records of who held the major offices over hundreds of years period. Then as well, there's a fair amount of information about their business relationships, their partnerships, the commercial relationships among those companies, and then also patronage, by which I mean the kind of more political part of how they sought recognition and support and favors from each other. And I'm going to talk in the rest of my time about these things that are highlighted in red and then yellow, okay? And I got into this because my advisor hired me to kind of get some data for him. Now, the first part of this data, and I kind of want to focus on this question of historical data and turning it into something that can be handled in network terms. And frankly, it takes a lot of steps, and I won't go through those laboriously. I just want to make you aware of kind of the steps of moving from historical data to computationally tractable data. So here's a page from our document in the Florentine archives. The state archives in Florence are in the Piazza Beccaria, which is on the Viale to the east of town, just beyond where Santa Croce is. And that's not that important, but if you're there and you're wandering around, you'll see these places. And in 1427, the city of Florence conducted a catasta, which is like a census. Every household turned in one of these documents where they talked about their land and who lived in the household and how much share of the public debt they had, as well as their commercial relationships and their interpersonal loans and debts. This is one page from one of the documents. There's about 10,000 households in Florence in 1427. All of them have this information, okay? This was a guy named Agnolo Mori. That's my printing up there in the top of the white page. And this is what the text looks like. It's in a handwriting that's called mercantesca. Not that you don't need to know that, but it's a particular kind of handwriting, which you might imagine when I was first showing this, it looks like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Like, it's not easy to read this. I would not expect you to be able to sit there and read it. It's in Italian. So at the top of this page, it says, fa una bottega d'arte di lana nel convento di San Brancazio, dove compagno Taddeo di Bartolomeo di Lorino, nella quale bottega si trovano gli infrascritti debitori, creditori e mercatanzia, come dice partitamente, which means he has a wool shop in this subunit. He's a partner of this guy. And they have these people to whom they owe money, who owe them money, and to who they owe money. Okay, so you can see this is an economic network relationship. In fact, multiple economic network relationships, because embedded in the top part of this document, it tells us who he was the partner with. And in the list part of this, it tells us who the partnership did business with. So this we have then, for Florence, we have data, like historical data, archival data that's greater than any other place in the world, probably prior to the French Revolution. And so we have what we can then develop is a comprehensive structure of the entire commercial credit network, right? Not one guy's book and then sort of assume what the whole rest of the world looked like from that. No, everybody's rendering of what the world was like. That's an incredible legacy of the city. Okay, so now I'll just take you through some steps as quickly as I can. Okay, he's a partner. So in this, what we did eventually is create a list of all the partnerships. And in this list, it's truncated. We give a code name to the company, the name it's called by themselves at the time, the industry in which it was operating, the number of credits and the number of debts it had and the amount of the value of those, the name of each partner, the family from which each partner came, their social status in the city, the neighborhood they lived in, their wealth level of their household in 1427, the year they were born. You see, like, we don't have all this information for everybody, but we have it for a lot of people. Now, once you have a list of partner, and we do that for each partner. So now once you have all of the people who participated as partners in this economy, you can create a matrix, such as the one I show here, a list of all the participants in the industries, and then whether or not they were partners with each other. So I'm showing here that the first participant was a partner of the fifth one. And this is a symmetrical matrix, right? Because if participant one is a partner of participant five, well, participant five has to be a partner of participant one, okay? So this is symmetrical network data about partnerships. I will not get into many very important, interesting questions about how we define the boundary of a network, and this is very complicated. You maybe get to that another time. Also, remember here, in the second part of this document, it gives a list of the companies with whom they did business. And at the bottom here, I'll just show you, you can see I tried to highlight that about where it says number 17 in my handwritten note in the margin, that says Cosimo e Lorenzo de' Medici and Company. So the Medici, the professor contractor mentioned, super important family. This is one of the most important banks in Florence in the 1400s. They did extensive business with the Pope. They're not the only important bank. There were about 45 banks operating in Florence at this time, and some of them pretty close to as big as the Medici Bank. Okay, but we have this information. How are these companies linked to each other? So now I'm showing you, well, here's a different network data set you can construct. A list of all of the credit relationships among all of the companies and the industries that they operated in. Okay, and I'm going to go quickly. I can't really acquaint you with all the details. You don't need that. You should not have that. So then you can create a matrix that way, where all the companies are listed on the rows and the columns, and you can have in the cells in the matrix the value in florins of the balance owing between them. Now, this is not symmetrical data because I might owe you money or you might owe me money, and it isn't necessarily the same thing. In many cases, the structure of an industry is that credit builds up in some places and debts build up in other places. Just by way of example, Florentine wool merchants often gave their product on consignment to cloth retailers so that retailers had credits owed to wool manufacturers, all right? And wool manufacturers owed credits to banks who provided financing for them. So this is the structure of the economy is reflected in the pattern of credits and debts in the aggregate. But this is not symmetrical data. Just so you know the difference between directed and undirected ties. There's two different, these are substantively different. I hope that's somewhat clear. Here's another page of these credits from a company from the Tornabuoni. These guys were very wealthy and they were allies of the Medici, and eventually they married into the Medici family. Not eventually, around this time they married into the Medici family. There are pages and pages like this of their economic ties for very large amounts. Let me say something else, just by way of a clarification. Each entry in this list kind of probably reflects a page or multiple pages in an original account book that the company had. And they would have ongoing transactions. It's like your bank, Chase Bank or something, having multiple account holders. And for each one of them, there's like blah, 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 lists of transactions. And at a certain point in time, there's a balance owing, right? These are the balances owing. We have almost none of the original account books that the companies kept. Almost zero are extant. So we only have this kind of like trace of an immense amount of economic activity. Okay, these guys were really wealthy. They were located in London. They did business all over Europe, but the opening of their account book, this is a document I found elsewhere in the data, in the archives. They start off here, al nome sia di Dio e della beata sua madre Madonna Santa Maria Vergine, etc., which means in the name of God and his blessed mother, Madonna, St. Mary the Virgin, and St. John the Baptist, and the evangelist, and the saints, blah, 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 that they concede profit to us along with the salvation of our souls and bodies. Here, I want to communicate this, the cultural ethos of Florence, right? These guys were so sophisticated and into money making and so networked. But the preface to their economic activity, the opening of this account book, talks as much about the salvation of their souls and prayers to the saints of the Catholic Church as it talks about like financial instruments. They're interwoven. You have to understand this to understand kind of the culture of the place. Here is a completely illegible page of what's called a copia commerciale, a copy of letters that were sent back and forth between these businesses. And in these letters, as I say, I've worked with this stuff for years. It's very hard to read this stuff. Very, very hard. What's in these things? It tells the partner company how to handle certain kinds of shipments or payments. And they use this phrase, pagate e posto a nostro conto, often means pay it and post it to our account. There's a lot of trust in the way that they allowed each other to do transactions on their behalf, okay? Really quite important aspect. They mentioned people they thought were trustworthy partners. They shared gossip about businesses that they thought were going bankrupt. And there's references, not a ton, but there are references to these terms like honor and loyalty and friendship. They framed commercial transactions in terms of amicizia, which is a very pliable notion of friendship. I show you this just because you can render commercial transactions into a pretty clean network that's digestible by a computer. But you need to understand all of this cultural communicative work going on in the background, greasing the wheels of these relationships, okay? And I'm interested in that, the cultural norm aspect. And I guess you guys are in communications, or like you could be in communications. You should also be interested in the communicative aspects underlying the operation of networks. I'm going to go on. So another area that I have done research on is patronage. And I've already said letters were indispensable in Florence. In many letters, they write things like, I wanted to tell you this a bocca, by mouth, okay? Meaning in person. But the letter is sort of an imperfect substitute for that communication. Nevertheless, it's interesting. They tell you in the letter is kind of a meta commentary on its own inadequacy, you know, like that's an interesting thing for them to do. What did they talk about? Commercial stuff, diplomacy, military stuff. They gave gifts to each other and wrote cover letters for them. They offered recommendations of people, just like we in academia offer letters of recommendation. They asked for favors. I'm looking for this office. My nephew is suitable for it. I'm wondering if you could work it out that he'd get this opportunity, like that kind of stuff, right? They asked for relief from the heavy, heavy, heavy tax burdens that the city imposed on them. Basically, what these were looking for is, I'd say, is recognition. They often end with the phrase, I recommend myself to you, meaning kind of like, I hope that you see me, right? You remember me, you see me. And so this is part of, again, the networky kind of quality of Florence, the desire for recognition and acknowledgement from each other, as well as material assistance. Okay, there's this, I put this link up of the Archivio di Stato site, and there's a huge, now the catalog of all of these hundreds of thousands of documents about the Medici family and their associates for like a 250-year period. Or 150-year period, sorry, more actually, and many of the documents in the state archives are letters, and there's hundreds of thousands of these letters. There are also other collections of them. I coded about 1,300 of them for a project I did some years ago. Let me move right along quickly. What do these letters look like? They look like this. Now, you can imagine that's not easy material to digest and figure out. Or they might look like this one. Okay, now this is actually easier to read, but you have to begin to understand some of the code to it. It starts off in the top left corner, carissimo e a me padre maggiore, which means dearest to me, carissimo, but that's really just spelled like K-M and then like an O at the top. So it's like a heavily abbreviated spelling of that word. Or they might look like this. That's not so hard to read. Or like this, which is actually not hard to read at all because it kind of imitates the script you might see in a church manuscript. Nevertheless, all of these letters are not the easiest material to kind of work through and tease out both the significance of them and other aspects. So let me just say a little bit about what I did or what I was trying to do. And if I can, maybe it's I don't know if you guys could read this, it's far away for you, but in the middle of this letter, this guy says, e potete estimare quanto ci sarà grato che ci para essere tratti dall'inferno e ridotti in paradiso, e di me e di miei figlioli potrete sempre disporre quanto di vostri fedeli amici servitori e schiavi in omnibus et per omnia, which means you may esteem how much we are grateful to you and to have been taken from the inferno and placed in paradise. This is a reference to Dante's Divine Comedy. And from me, myself and my sons, you may always dispose of us as your most faithful friends, servants, and slaves. Okay? That's the kind of stuff that sometimes appears in these patronage letters where people are seeking favors and help from each other. Okay, this is an example of, you know what, I think I'm not going to talk through this so much. I'm going to skip the actual text and go on to this. What do we see in these letters? Broadly speaking, there are two aspects. There's a lot of standardization. They open with typical salutations. They use typical turns of phrase. Often, when it's like structured in according to letter writing as it was practiced and taught in the Middle Ages. A letter has 5 parts. There's an opening salutation. It has a place where you ingratiate yourself with the person you're writing to. And then it says, e la cagione di questa, meaning, and the reason for this writing is, and then you narrate in the body of the letter what you're writing about. And then it has a turn kind of where it says, e così, or allora per questo vi prego che, which is, I pray of you that. That's the request, okay? And then there's a closing part. So there's a regular structure to these letters, even though they don't all follow it. And there's a regularity in the use of language in these letters too. So hopefully we'd be able to see the regular patterns of communication involved in this form of patronage correspondence. The same way you might apply that logic to the way that Silicon Valley executives talk to each other, or the way that hip hop artists talk to each other, or whatever, in any culture, okay? The second thing is, though, that there's a lot of agency, as sociologists say, in the way it gets done. So there's a kind of a strategic quality and a bit of an improvisational quality. So they will use superlatives. They won't just say dear father. They'll say like dearest, most singular father, you know? And then they will politely ask a request, but they'll make it known that they expect to be served. So they'll say things, I have confidence in you that you will give this to me. I know that you know that I'm deserving of this, right? That's a pretty like gutsy, ballsy way to ask for something. When they don't get a response, they might write something like, I think my letter suffered from a bad service in the mail, which is like, okay, I know you haven't responded because you don't want to, but I'm going to let you off, like the way Goffman talked about face-saving strategies, and give you a second chance kind of to help me out here, right? Anyway, there's all these kinds of interesting discursive techniques. Again, this is kind of part of what communications scholars, at least some of them that I think of and know, would focus on as as kind of part of the culture of favor seeking in Florence. In that letter that I skipped over, the guy says, like, give me this office. It would give me the heart to be a man like the others. What does this mean? He's saying, give me this and I will become who you want me to be. It will make me like the other people you already trust, meaning the Medici's henchmen and so on. But it also, he sort of writes it in such a way that the service I will give to you will be more meaningful because I am giving it freely. Volentieri is a word they sometimes use. Okay. So like, it's not any great shakes if somebody who wants to be my doormat offers to be my doormat. But if it's somebody I think who really has value to me and autonomy, and they offer their services, that should be more valuable to me, you see? But this is all about how the relationship is framed. There's other letters. I'm not going to go through some of this. It's not really worth it, but this is kind of typical of a letter written in the later part of the 1400s. You know how much I've desired this recognition from you, and I'm certain that it's not difficult for you to arrange it. See, like, this is this, like, I know you can do this. I'm not begging. I know that in your kindness, you've always done honor to me. Now, on this occasion, do not abandon me, and let it please you to give me this happiness, this favor, for never will I forget it. This is the nature of the way that they formed these network ties with each other, right? It would be wonderful if we had letters from everybody in Florence to everybody else, or like in that kind of whole network way. We don't. Most of the letters that exist are written to members of just a handful of families. So we can't really do whole network studies, but we can, very briefly, we can kind of look at the patterns that in different kinds of letters with different topics, a different constellation of key terms gets used. And I won't go over the details, just to sort of show you that we can do a kind of a frequency count, or give a profile of a letter of a certain type. And the Florentines must have been sensitive to the differences of vocabulary and style to use in different topics and letters of different topics. Can you do computational analysis with this? It's really hard. The texts are hard to read. Many of them are partial. A lot of them have been like water damaged. They vary in length. There's all these abbreviations. They spell things differently. If you have a letter from a Venetian, it's got Z's and Z, like Z's and stuff in it instead of C's. Like they spelled things differently. So hypothetically, you know, if you had this entire corpus of text, you could run it through a computer and figure out, what are these topics? I generated these topics based on my reading of the letters. Could a computer come up with topics the same as these or different than these based on the way the words cluster, right? You may end up talking about that in this class. I don't know. But I'm skeptical about the ability to do that because of the imperfections of the raw material and the amount of work to make it more available to a computer. Why does this matter? Okay. First of all, we might see that in individual letters, you know, an individual letter is one thing, but what I was always interested in, what about the aggregation of these letters? What's the aggregate macro consequence of people writing this way? Does it reinforce and deepen a system of patronage and deference? You may find out or know that the Medici began as a family among other families in the 1400s, early 1400s, but they became the princes of Florence in the later 1400s with Lorenzo the Magnificent, and then in fact princes with Cosimo I in the 1500s. So how could that have been a product of these social dynamics? Another thing is, the city was always fighting wars, always running out of money. They taxed their citizens for money at a very high rate. It probably was the case that those who were the richest Florentines, the city was most in debt to its richest citizens, and this created certain kinds of social inequalities and political inequalities over time. I'm out of time. I can't say anything more about that. But so I just want to say, this is my last slide. Florence was a society of networks. Personal connections were very important in structuring the city. We can look at individual level documents, and if we look at enough of them, we can begin to generate an idea of the patterns that exist, whether it's about who marries whom, or who does business with whom, or who writes letters to whom, who sides with whom politically. We can also see patterns in the communication mechanisms that supported all of this network relational activity. And in Florence, you will not get a chance to see this stuff, but just know there's a huge storehouse of documentary evidence for these networks. It's just variable in the extent to which it's tractable to computer analysis. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I did my best to give you a whirlwind tour.
Thank you so much. So as I was listening to you, Paul, I was reminded of something I read in the book that you wrote. So Paul wrote a book called The Art of the Network, Strategic Interaction and Patronage in Renaissance Florence. And the reason I was reminded of the book when I heard Paul talk is because he opens the preface to his book using the style of letters that he just described. So let me read to you the opening sentences. Respected reader, this is the preface of his book. Respected reader, dearest to me as much as a brother or sister, I have not written a book to you in the past. There not have been any need for one. But the reason for writing this one is to remind you, as much as I know and I'm able, that the social network ties we have with each other are not merely given, nor do they have a simple fixed meaning. They are constructed, managed, and maintained by means of the cultural work involved in discursive practices. And he goes on for several pages and ends with, I recommend myself to you. That's what he talked about today. So again, thank you so much, Paul, for taking time to give us this. This is our very first class, and I couldn't think of a better way of ending it than hearing Paul tell us about all his exploits with actual data collecting, getting your hands dirty with data, and not that clean data at times, as you can tell. So thanks again so much, Paul, for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Get out and enjoy the city, you know, get out and see stuff and breathe in the polluted air of Florence.
We will do that, certainly. Thanks again.
All
Have
right.
a good morning.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.